So, hi and welcome to Mainline MUFON. I'm Jennifer Stein, and I am grateful that you're joining us on Zoom today or tonight, whenever you're watching this, to see this fabulous presentation that James is going to give to us on ancient Sumer. So let me tell you a little bit about James. He has served as a planetarium director at the Neil Armstrong Planetarium in Altoona, Pennsylvania since about 2003. James also co-founded a space race museum in the planetarium's lobby in about 2016. And he recently founded the Mountain Lion Observatory at an historic Fort Roberdeau site in Tyrone Township, Pennsylvania. James is also a high school astronomy teacher in Altoona Public School System. He hosts regular public and private night sky observation programs throughout the year, and he teaches a 9-week adult evening course on topics ranging from UFOs, the Apollo moon missions, and understanding the night sky, in addition to Sumerian culture, history, and artifacts. So James is a field investigator and the state section director for the Mutual UFO Network, and he's presented at a number of our conferences in Pennsylvania. And he hosts a regular podcast called Majestic Ears Only. He co-hosts this with Jason Geese and Brock Cease, who are fellow MUFON field investigators. So welcome, James, to our program today via Zoom. It's so nice to have you here, and I'm really looking forward to your presentation. So I'm going to allow you to switch the screen over to your presentation, and you get to take it away. If I have any questions, I'll jump in, but thank you.
That sounds awesome, Jennifer, and thanks for having me, Mainline MUFON. I hope that you enjoy this one. This is a presentation I've done a few times. I call it The Legend of Planet 9, Planet X, Nibiru, and Nearby Brown Dwarfs. So, does our sun really have a distant solar system companion that loops through every couple thousand years? Did the ancients know about this? Did they try to leave record of it? But in modern times, we just haven't been paying attention. So we're going to look at the problem from all sides, and then you can decide on your own. So let's go ahead and get started then. So probably the legend begins with a man that some of you might recognize because he and Eric von Däniken are also synonymous with ancient aliens, and that's Zecharia Sitchin. He is one of the only people on Earth who have ever done translations of ancient Sumerian cuneiform tablets. So cuneiform meant wedge shape. This was the earliest form of writing that we know about, and the Sumerians would actually take a little wedge-shaped stylus, a piece of wood, and then they would press it into wet mud or clay, and that would basically make their form of writing. And so some of his translations are highly criticized, but one of the problems is there's only a handful of people on Earth that can actually read ancient Sumerian cuneiform. And so there's not a lot of people that can actually cross-check it. So what Sitchin found is that the Sumerians seem to have a very, very advanced knowledge of our solar system. Keep in mind that Sumeria is generally believed to be the oldest culture on Earth. It originates between the area of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in modern-day Iraq, and it probably dates back to 3,000 or 4,000 BC. But recently, archaeology has found other sites like Göbekli Tepe in Turkey that could push this timeline back a great deal. But this is still at a time where humans knew very little about the solar system. And even Western Europe would believe in an Earth-centered solar system for many thousand years more. So what Sitchin found is that the Sumerians seem to know a great deal, and we're not sure how. For starters, they actually had a sun-centered or heliocentric solar system, which is what we believe in today. And surprisingly, they had up to a 12-planet solar system and not the 8 or 9-planet system that we knew about today. And keep in mind, at this time, any other cultures would have only known out to the planet Saturn, because that's the last planet you can truly see with the naked eye. And so what I'm showing you on the screen now is really the debated Sumerian tablet. And this is where some people believe that the Sumerians are actually showing that they knew about a sun-centered solar system. So at the center, you can see the largest object, which is probably what we call our sun today. And then there are objects of different sizes. And curiously, they do seem to be fairly scaled to the sizes of the planets today. But then if you notice in the upper left, there appears to be an additional object, which the Sumerians called Nibiru. And so if we take it back one slide, according to Sitchin's translations, if you look in the lower left, according to the Sumerian belief, there was an object coming into our solar system, which they called Marduk, after their god Marduk. It then collided with one of our planets called Tiamat, and then the resulting object and the debris with it was associated with this planet Nibiru, which then continued its elliptical loop through the solar system and went back out to the distant reaches. So this is where the legend actually comes from. And so looking at it today, people have started to do this with Ancient Aliens too, Jennifer. They've started to basically look at some of these things and say, wait a minute, are we certain that this was just ancient fairy tales or science fiction? What if these people were actually describing something they were really seeing just in the best ways they could? So what I find really intriguing is people have read up on the descriptions of this Nibiru, and some researchers now think if it was actually real, it may not have been a god, but it may have been what's actually called a brown dwarf. And it could have made periodic passes through our solar system. So on this graphic, if you look in the lower left, it does a really nice job of showing us about what a brown dwarf is. So you can see Earth, and this is all to scale. You can see our biggest planet, Jupiter. And then in the upper left, you can see our sun, Sol. And our sun is about an average yellow main sequence star. We do have low mass stars, which are called red dwarfs. And you can see one of those right here. And then in between, in sort of the gray area between large planet and small star, we get what are called brown dwarfs. And so some people think that this is what Nibiru may have actually been. And so brown dwarfs definitely can be a potential danger to our solar system, even though it's not really well known yet. So they're essentially made of the same materials as our sun. Our sun and Jupiter and Saturn and the larger gas planets are made of hydrogen and helium. And brown dwarfs are made of that too. The only big difference is, unlike a small star, they don't quite get large enough to generate nuclear fusion in their cores. So basically, they're really, really big, but they're not giving off any of their own light. So because of that, the danger here, something like this could get very, very close to our solar system without us seeing it. In fact, probably the only way it could actually radiate for us to see it in advance would be in the infrared part of the spectrum, because brown dwarfs are going to give off some heat due to the compressed gas. So remember that, viewers, because infrared is going to come up later in the presentation. So this is the idea. Nibiru might be a brown dwarf. And curiously, we do have a fair amount of at least circumstantial evidence to support the fact that every couple thousand years, something pretty crazy goes down on the Earth. We have ice core samples from Antarctica that are deep enough that they actually go back thousands of years. And at some layers, they found high concentrations of volcanic ash. The other place that they found this is in petrified tree rings. So if you know anything basic about tree rings, probably everybody knows that a tree puts a new ring on each year. And if a tree has had a period of rapid growth, the gap between the rings will be wider because it grew more rapidly that year. But if you have a period of slow growth, the rings will be very tightly spaced together. And in some of these petrified tree rings, they have found that for some reason, there are what appear to be periods where the skies are a lot darker and the trees are growing very slowly. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that this has to be evidence of something crazy going down, but it does seem to show that every couple thousand years, we have more rapid than normal volcanism, and we do have the skies growing darker. And so, Jennifer, to me, one of the fascinating things is this really makes me look at some tales from the ancients in a totally different light. And that includes the great flood of Noah. So I actually went to Catholic school from kindergarten the whole way through high school, and my faith is still very important to me today. But like a lot of modern Catholics, I sort of took the great flood story as just an allegory, because I thought to myself, I thought, come on, there's no way anybody could build a ship this big to have two of every single animal on it. And even if they did, even if you could actually do this, only having two of every animal would right away lead to inbreeding in the second and third generation, and that's probably not likely to sustain. But what really started to change my mind is I learned that over 1,300 cultures on Earth have great flood stories of their own. So maybe two or three or four, this might just be some collective idea of the unconscious or subconscious that people thought up. But 1,300 cultures makes me think something must have actually happened. And so I think to myself, from an astronomy perspective, what if this wasn't really the wrath of God? What if this was some type of visitor looping through our solar system? And the ancients at the time just took this to be God's wrath, but it really wasn't. The other interesting thing is, if you have 1,300 cultures all building boats, you might not get all of the animal diversity, but you could get a heck of a lot of it. So sort of tying in with the ancient aliens a little bit, sometimes I wonder whether other advanced civilizations knew this was going to happen, and so they tried to warn as many cultures as they could. So what we do know, and this comes from my college geology background, is we do know that right now, for some unexplained reason, Earth's magnetic field will entirely flip-flop every couple thousand years, and we don't know why this happens. And so the best evidence that we can see of this, everybody, if y'all look at the image in the upper right, this is usually called zebra striping, and this is found at the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. So this is the largest mountain range on Earth, and it runs north and south through the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. We just don't think about it being a mountain range because most of it is down underwater, except places like Iceland where it actually gets above the surface.
I actually was in Iceland and I stood in that ridge.
Is that right?
I can send you pictures. You can have it for your presentation. Yeah.
That's really awesome. That's so cool. So what geologists have found is as lava hardens into rock, any iron grains that it had inside it basically work like tiny little compass needles, and they'll always point to magnetic north at the time that the rock lithifies. And so if you look at this graphic here, everybody, what they found is every couple thousand years, all the iron inclusions are pointing one direction. Then every couple thousand years, they'll all point the other direction, and back and forth and back and forth. And so this basically proves to geologists that at least our magnetic field is flipping. North becomes south and south becomes north. And the crazy thing is we're actually overdue for another pole reversal, and it just hasn't happened. And I don't know about you, Jennifer, but I kind of worry a little bit just based on our satellite grids and our airplanes, how dependent we are on the magnetic field today. I just sort of wonder what's going to happen if the field reverses in modern society, if it'll be a big deal or not. So, one interesting twist on this that a few authors have suggested throughout history, what if it's not just our magnetic field flipping? What if it's the entire planet physically flipping back and forth? So a couple different works to cite with you. And the first one comes from a mysterious author named Chan Thomas. And I say mysterious because it seems that nobody knows very little about Chan Thomas. Nobody knows where he came from or what happened to him. And it seems like this is his only published work. And this was called The Adam and Eve Story, The History of Cataclysms. And Thomas did a nifty bit of geology. He went to different areas on the Earth, and he was able to give some fairly compelling evidence through examining rock layers that these areas were all prone to very, very rapid shifts in a very short amount of time. Now, if that's all that we had, probably this book, like a lot of them, we could just relegate to the realm of urban legend. But this man must have been on to something because the CIA actually classified this book. And so they took it off shelves, and he did not have permission to print it for many, many decades. And initially that might surprise people because you think, well, most of us live in the United States. This is a free country and we have free speech. But a lot of people don't realize if you try to publish something or you come up with an invention that could potentially endanger the national security of the United States can actually step in and say, no, no, that's off limits. You're not going to do that. And looking into it, I believe, Jennifer, in the last 10 years, they have actually stopped 300 plus inventions and publications. So this is not out of the question. And so the book is back out now, but people who actually had the original claim that the new version is highly sanitized, and it's not the same thing as the original. And so what's intriguing about this notion to me, it initially seems quite radical, but if you had a rapid planet shift, that alone could easily explain the Great Flood, because it doesn't really feel like we're moving, but our planet is actually rotating at a speed of about 1,000 miles per hour. That's obviously why we have daytime and nighttime as we face the sun and then turn away from it. So the really terrifying thing here to me, Jennifer, is let's say a solar system visitor came through and its gravitational influence temporarily stopped Earth's spin. Well, the crust and the land masses would stop, but you got to remember the water and the air are still moving at 1,000 miles per hour for a short amount of time. So that right there could absolutely flood large areas of the planet. And that's going to dovetail us nicely into one of the favorite legends of many, the legend of Atlantis. And so this idea, I probably don't need to explain the backstory, but it could substantiate the idea that Atlantis was much more tropical. So people have looked a lot of different places, but one of the most intriguing theories to me is that Atlantis actually is Antarctica. And up until very recent times, the landmass we now know as Antarctica was much, much closer to the equator. So just quick background on Atlantis. Prior to a couple years ago, I was actually fairly skeptical on it. We really only have one point source, and that's the Greek author Plato. And he basically described that it was a vast naval power. And the only geographical location that Plato gives is that it lied across from the Pillars of Hercules, which now we basically think is the Strait of Gibraltar. So you basically have Spain, you have Morocco and Africa, and then that's that narrow little channel that leads into the Mediterranean. So it's basically like, well, geez, thanks Plato for that. Plato's just basically saying it's somewhere out in the Atlantic Ocean. And so he mentioned it being a multi-ring city of high technology, and then it sank into the ocean in a single day and night of misfortune. And so people have looked all around the world for Atlantis. Usually they concentrate on the Atlantic or the Caribbean, where they found the Bimini Road. Some people think it's actually in Northern Africa or even in France or England. And so I'm pretty open-minded about where Atlantis might be. Here's one other idea. If you check out this picture, this was actually found on Google Earth a couple years ago. You can actually examine what's called the bathymetry, which means the topography of the ocean floor. And this gridwork pattern was found on the ocean floor right off the coast of Africa, possibly where Plato could have indicated that Atlantis was. And what intrigued me the most is Google's explanation for what this was, because I found it highly questionable. Google came out very quickly and said, no, no, that's no ancient culture. Those are just the survey lines for a survey ship that was going back and forth and taking bathymetry readings. And for any of you who have ever been on a boat, you know that it's pretty difficult for a boat to make right angle turns. So I just wanted to throw this out there. There is some compelling evidence for Atlantis, different places, and a lot of times it's ignored. My personal theory that I find the most interesting, though, is what if Atlantis actually is Antarctica? And we do have some evidence of that. We do have some maps from the Middle Ages, the Dark Ages, that appear to show Antarctica. And this was odd for a couple reasons. Number one, Antarctica had not even been discovered yet. It wasn't actually discovered until about the 1850s. Now, initially, you might think to yourself, well, why would that be? It looks so big on maps. Understand, any flat map that we see is basically a flat projection of a round object. And so you have to make trade-offs. What part of the map do you want to project the most accurately? And so most maps basically go for an accurate projection around the mid-latitudes, but then they sacrifice the polar regions, which look a lot bigger. So for starters, Antarctica is not really that big. Number two, in all the water surrounding it, we have a lot of ice. So ships simply didn't get close to it. So it wasn't discovered until the 1850s. And then the other really spectacular thing about these maps, Jennifer, is they're showing the land outlines of Antarctica. And so the land outlines weren't even known until the 1980s, when scientists set off seismic charges and they measured how long it took the shock wave to bounce back up. So they could basically tell where the ice stopped and the land mass began. So very quickly, let's take a look at both of these maps. This one is called the Piri Reis map. And this came from a Turkish army general named Piri Reis. And from his own writings, he basically said he compiled this map off of previous maps that he had seen. Now, Jennifer, quick question from your end. Can you actually see my mouse cursor, or can you not?
Yes, we can.
Oh,
Yes,
good. Okay. So for those of you watching at home, basically this is the bump of Africa. Here's the bump of South America. That's the technical geography term, is bump. But then the area you want to look at is right in here. It supposedly shows some very detailed coastline of Antarctica. But to me, the even more spectacular map is right here. This is the Orontes Phineus map. Now, for starters, check out the time frame. Both of these are made in the 1500s. So this is the dark ages. This is the absolute low point of human creativity. And here you can actually see the southern tip of South America. Not only do you get the entire land outline of Antarctica, but Phineus is also showing you mountain ranges and river basins that are currently buried under miles and miles of ice. And the really interesting thing, and keep in mind, this was at a time when most people throughout Europe still thought the Earth was flat, is where you actually see Antarctica at the 90-degree south mark is only a couple degrees off of where it is right now today. So for some reason, we have two maps surfacing of a landmass that the ancients didn't even know about. And we had this hundreds of years before they even knew the land outline. So maybe they did know about Antarctica. So just one more book to share with you. And this is kind of an interesting one. This one came out in 1958. It was from a geologist named Charles Hapgood, and it was called Earth's Shifting Crust. And Hapgood made an argument that plate tectonics, so if you think about the Earth being a puzzle and it's this slow, gradual puzzle piece movement of the plates, Hapgood claimed there was a lot more to it. So beneath our crust, which is called the lithosphere, the layer right below that in geology is called the astenosphere. And it's basically like a plasticky flowing area due to the heat of Earth. Think about it being like silly putty. So Hapgood made an argument that due to that layer, the entire crust could rapidly shift up to 40 degrees at a time. Now, not a lot of people know Hapgood's name today, but he had a pretty big heavyweight of science in his corner. And that, of course, was the great Albert Einstein. Hapgood had actually corresponded back and forth with Einstein. And Einstein so ardently believed in this theory that he actually wrote the foreword to Hapgood's book. So we do have a number of well-respected scientists making claims that for some reason, the entire crust can rapidly shift. So just to take it out to other members of the solar system, and this is what I really find fascinating, do we have some evidence that this has happened to other planets as well? And I think we actually do. What you see here in this graphic are the axes of rotation of all 8 planets in our solar system. And for starters, astronomers are not entirely sure why the planets aren't rotating totally vertically. because based on our mainstream theory of how the planets formed, all of the planets that we should see should more or less be like Mercury that you see right here, with a nearly vertical axis of rotation. So the leading theory right now is throughout their history, planets were impacted by different objects, and that gradually knocked the axes over. But we have to understand that some of these are really, really severe. So the ones I want to point out in particular are Uranus and Venus. So Uranus orbits in a very odd way. Its axis basically is pointed at the sun, and so it rolls backwards like a barrel as it revolves around the sun. And the really wild thing about Uranus is, unlike the rocky Earth, it's a Jovian planet. It's mostly made of gas. So I think it would be really, really difficult for an object large enough to hit into a condensed ball of gas and knock that over. But maybe even more spectacular is Venus. So when you look at Earth's closest neighbor, Venus, initially it looks like it's orbiting vertical. But what we have to realize here, Jennifer, is Venus is actually tipped entirely upside down. And it is not only tipped upside down, it spins backwards of the other planets. So Uranus and Venus both spin backwards of the other planets. And it spins so slowly that a day on Venus is actually longer than a year. And so again, mainstream astronomers think it was hit by something really, really big, but they've never been able to find a big enough crater on Venus to compensate for that. Now, probably most scientists would say, well, it happened so long ago that Venus's crust wasn't totally formed yet, so we can't see evidence of it. But my own personal hypothesis is, what if something was looping through our solar system, and basically its gravitational pull knocked all these planets off their axes? And so a lot of people worry about black holes coming into our solar system and sucking everything in, but I've actually seen computer simulations, and the most dangerous aspect of a large visitor coming into our solar system, whether it's a brown dwarf, whether it's a black hole, isn't sucking entire planets in, but that its gravitational pull could change their orbits. It could slingshot some planets out of the solar system. It could send other planets careening into the sun, or it could just knock them off their axes. And this is exactly what some ancient cultures said happened. So just one example for you, I've always found this one interesting. The Chinese were absolutely excellent naked eye astronomers. So for example, the reason that modern astronomers today know that Halley's Comet loops around our sun about every 76 years is the Chinese were actually keeping record of this for thousands of years. And you can actually see some of their comet drawings here in the background. So they actually reported a time when their astronomers saw 3 suns in the sky at a time. And as soon as the 3 suns appeared, there was a period of violent earthquakes, and the tsunamis, the tidal waves got so big that they actually crashed miles and miles inland, and they actually formed lakes that didn't dry up for many decades. And so, like a lot of things with ancient aliens, this account is basically just ignored by mainstream scientists and geologists and archaeologists today. But I have to ask, what if the Chinese were truly describing something that was happening in the sky, and these 3 suns were basically our sun and then 2 other visitors that were looping through, and the gravitational pull caused this water surge here on the Earth? So let's take it into modern times. For those of you who have never really researched anything about Nibiru, it can be very confusing because there's a number of terms that sometimes aren't used correctly or sometimes are used interchangeably that kind of muddies the water. So one term that you see a lot is sometimes called Planet X. So sometimes Planet X refers to Nibiru, or sometimes it's actually synonymous with the well-respected search that mainstream astronomers are doing for Planet 9 today. Sometimes you'll see this term Nemesis used in conjunction with Nibiru, but I've also seen it used as the idea that Earth actually has a twin that orbits on the opposite side of the sun from us. So basically you have the sun, Yep, us here is the Earth. And then perfectly opposite the Earth, you have a second Earth. And we never see it because it's always opposite the sun. Now, me personally, Jennifer, I'm probably the most skeptical on Nemesis because I feel like even if we couldn't visually see it, we could send another space probe to the other side of the sun to look for it. Or just its gravitational influence would affect the orbits of the other planets, and we would know that it was still out there. In fact, it's how they actually found Neptune and eventually found the former planet Pluto. So personally, out of all these theories, everybody, I think Nemesis, as it's usually described, is about the least likely. So if you check out this image here, letter G, 2 years ago, we actually got the first confirmation that visitors can come into our solar system and pay us a visit from outside the solar system. So what you see here is an artist representation of the first ever interstellar asteroid that was confirmed. This was called Oumuamua. And so I say it's a representation because they did use radar to basically confirm that it was a very long, unusually elliptical shape. And so there was a lot of intrigue for Oumuamua, not only because it was looping through from another or from outside our solar system, but a very well-respected mainstream astronomer from Harvard came out publicly on at least 2 different occasions, props to this man, and actually suggested that Oumuamua was either an actual extraterrestrial spaceship or that extraterrestrials had actually attached a solar sail to the surface. And his reasoning was basically this. According to Kepler's laws of planetary motion and Newton's laws of motion, the farther away you get from the sun, the less the gravitational pull is, and so the slower and slower the orbit of an object will be. So that's why planets like Mercury and Venus and Earth that are close to the sun orbit or revolve very rapidly. And planets like Uranus, Neptune, the former planet Pluto, orbit very, very slowly. The really curious thing about Oumuamua, everybody, is as it was leaving our sun, it actually started to pick up speed when it should have just been slowing down. So whether or not you think it has anything to do with extraterrestrials, it did come from outside our solar system and was moving in a very curious way. So could our sun actually have a companion that mainstream science does not actually recognize? Well, let's look at it statistically. This might surprise you, but about half the stars in the nighttime sky that we see are actually double stars. 2 stars there, either orbiting around each other or in what are called wide binaries instead of just one. So if our sun truly is just a single star, that's actually somewhat rare. There's also some mathematical evidence to support that out beyond Pluto, there is something very, very big. Now, this might surprise a lot of people. The mainstream tries to show us today that the idea of a Planet X has never been taken seriously. And they always conjure up ideas of tinfoil hats and conspiracies and rabbit holes and the like. But this could not be farther from the truth. So from about 1950 to 1983, and I've included a really awesome link right here you should totally check out. It was actually considered a triumph of mathematics that they knew something else would be out there. So astronomers looked very closely at the orbit of the planet Neptune, and they could see that there were some slight derivations that basically proved there should have been something large and massive out beyond it. And even after Pluto was found in the 19 teens, they knew that Pluto didn't have enough mass to account for that. Here's where things get really scandalous. In 1983, now you can see this artist representation. This is not Hubble. This was the IRAS. This was an infrared orbiting telescope, very successful. NASA scientists actually made an announcement to the public that they had found an object as big or even bigger than Jupiter lurking in the outer reaches of the solar system. And this story curiously got pulled only a couple days later, and then the scientists who announced it quickly said, no, our mistake. This was simply a cloud of gas. Now, just to show you this is not an urban legend, here's just a sampling of some of the headlines that did go along with it. So this was a really, really big deal for just a couple days there in 1983. Also, from about 84 through 93, scientists were being very, very open-minded. And Jennifer, I just love the correlation they were making here. They started to try to link periodic extinctions on the Earth, like the asteroid or comet that officially wiped out the dinosaurs 65 million years ago, or like the Great Dying Event that happened 250 million years ago that basically opened a niche for the dinosaurs. And they started to ask, wait a minute, what if these aren't just random collision events? What if this is actually a pattern? What if there's some periodic orbit of something that's coming through and disturbing Earth or knocking comets or asteroids out of their orbits that are causing this? So to me, this was really exciting research. But then around the mid-90s, it all comes to a crashing halt. So like any good conspiracy, we have at least one mysterious death. And sadly, this time, it was a very respected astronomer named Robert Harrington. So Harrington was a big believer that our sun did have a companion. He made his own calculations and actually took what just amounted to basically like a backyard type telescope, probably no bigger than about that in diameter, 8 or 10 inches. And he took this on a plane ride with him to the southern hemisphere, because according to Harrington's calculations, you would be able to pick up Planet X in a telescope, but it would only be visible from the southern hemisphere. Now, at this point, it probably sounds just like an urban legend, but apparently his calculations were on point, because only a couple days after arriving, he contacts NASA and the US Naval Observatory to let them know that he did find Planet X. But then mysteriously, he contracts and dies from cancer of the esophagus in only 5 days. And so the story never gets out to the mainstream media, and there's no announcement about it. Now, in no way does this undermine or diminish how deadly cancer can be. I'm sure that we've all lost members of our family to cancer. But it is very curious to see a perfectly healthy man suddenly contract cancer and then die from it in only 5 days. What's even more curious to me is following Harrington's death, the mainstream astronomical community totally flip-flops in their opinion of Planet X. So here's just one example right here. This was from the Lakeland Ledger, June 6, 1993. And this is just an excerpt from it. But basically, it critiques anybody who was looking for Planet X, saying it was simply erroneous observations and calculations. So erroneous, root word error. So basically, they are filled with error. So then down at the bottom, and I got this from online, but it's a very good critique. It says, notice use of words like hypothetical, inferred, presumed, and erroneous. And I highlighted this paragraph. Essentially 43 years worth of research and data from multiple scientists and astronomers from around the world is suddenly just erroneous. But the critics who wrote these things did nothing to show why it was erroneous. Basically, it was just a slander attack. So now, in 2011, so up to modern times, it seems like we've once again reversed everybody. So now people are starting to look for Planet X or Nibiru or another companion again. But some people think that some NASA scientists may have accidentally admitted to this. So now I'm going to play for you our first video clip. And this one usually circulates where at least some people believe that NASA inadvertently admitted that they had actually found this. So let me just give you the background. You're going to be seeing a clip from what was called the NEOWISE conference. So NEO stood for Near Earth Object. So this is a team of scientists basically using an infrared telescope and a sky survey to be able to look for objects that could potentially be hazardous to the Earth. And at one point during the conference, they are actually taking calls from the public. So Jennifer, is it okay if I go ahead and cue up this video clip?
Absolutely. Let's hope
Okay, let me try to do it just real quick here.
Ingenuity, huge amounts of computing power, and then
Okay, I think I've got it.
Okay, we'll try share screen.
I will. And so the astronomer you're mostly going to be hearing from here is Amy Miser, who's a very young, very talented astronomer. And so she starts to answer these calls very, very professionally, but some people feel like she accidentally slipped up and said a little more than she should. So just listen and decide for yourself.
Hours and hours, months of discussions with colleagues, poring over the data to validate the results.
Thank you. I realize you're focusing on near-Earth asteroids today, but there's been so much talk about the potential for finding a planet X or some sort of large body through the WISE survey. Can you comment on any status on that sort of search, or maybe even reassure people that planet X isn't coming to get them next year?
Yes, this is Amy Miser. I'm happy to answer this one. Planet X is not coming to get us. But we are looking to see if there are any other bodies in the outer part of the solar system with the WISE data. This is a very natural project for WISE. And so we're still working on it right now. We've obviously just returned a huge amount of data from the telescope. It's going to take us a long time to sort through. But the initial results are very promising. You may have seen earlier results where we've discovered a new class of very cool type of stars with WISE. But the search is still on, and we don't think that there's anything that's
Listen carefully here.
We think that this is just a sort of if there is something out there, it would be a large body in a roughly circular orbit.
Okay, keep listening. They think this caller's disconnected, but he's not.
So when you say the initial results are very promising, yeah, the initial results are very promising. Anything else you wanted to say on that point?
We've actually been able to confirm the discovery of 100 new objects that are these very cool stars called brown dwarfs. And so that's very similar to what people are interested in looking for. So we've actually found some of these that are relatively close to the Earth, but none of these are closer at this point than the nearest star to our solar system.
Okay. So Jennifer, any thoughts on that video clip very quickly?
Well, she obviously confirms there are some brown dwarfs, but she says they're no further than any other solar system near the Earth, I think, correct?
Yes, you're absolutely correct. Now, let me ask, can you see my PowerPoint presentation again?
I can still see the video, and
okay.
The video's frozen.
Good. I think I have it figured out. Just give me 1 minute and we'll get the PowerPoint presentation right back up.
I did recall knowing about Harrington because Zecharia Sitchin went to visit with Harrington. And it was shortly after that visit that Zach had with him that Harrington was dead. And if I am not mistaken, didn't Harrington work for a national observatory of some sort? Or he was the national science advisor or something like that?
I believe that he did. He was clearly, even though a lot of regular people wouldn't know about him, he was a very, very well-respected astronomer at the time. So unlike some of the people we talked about, he is not only known for this. He didn't come out of nowhere.
Right, that's right.
Right. So these are the two key areas in the video clip that some people are a little bit concerned about. So for starters, Amy Miser does get very, very specific and basically mentions it's a large body in a roughly circular orbit. Then when the caller, who seems to know at least something, keeps pushing, she starts to bring up brown dwarfs and announces that they've discovered at least 100 new ones. And I've always found that fascinating, and I actually looked for NASA's output, their research on these brown dwarfs, where exactly they are, how far away they are, and so far I haven't been able to find anything about it. So then, ever since about 2014, now it seems cool again for mainstream astronomers to be looking for Planet X. And so it's kind of ironic to me, we're now exactly back where we started in the 1950s, only it's about 70 years later. And so what I want to do for this last part here, Jennifer, and for our listeners and our viewers, is I wanted to show some potential threats. So let's just say that there is actually something out there. What if governments, what if space agencies know, and could they be covering it up? So to me, one of the most curious objects to me is a carbon star that's called CW Leonis. And if you look at the root word here, that always gives away what constellation it's in. This is in the constellation Leo the Lion, which is a very famous constellation of the spring. And officially, it's a carbon star. So that's a star maybe a little older than our sun that's fused up to carbon. And officially, it's very far away. It's about 650 light years away. And it's barely seen in visible wavelengths. But what's rather odd to me, if you look in infrared, it is suddenly the second brightest object in the whole sky next to our own sun. So this inset that you all see here is actually from Google Earth. If you turn on Google Sky and put on the infrared filter, it suddenly looks exceptionally bright. And what struck me as very odd is there's very, very little about CW Leonis online. And here it is, the second brightest object in the sky in infrared. And so I looked up anything I could find, which was very little. And officially astronomers think that it's just a star that's cloaked in a large dust cloud. And so the radiation from the star hits into the cloud and heats it up, which is what's causing all the infrared, as it starts to blow off its outer layers. But it's curious to me too, because we don't see any other stars on the sky that radiate this brightly in infrared. And so what else is very odd to me, and every couple months I check to make sure these things are still there, and they are, there are places on Google Sky where there are permanently black boxes placed right over them. And here you can see just one. And if you want to find it for yourself, you have to enter these coordinates right here. And I thought, boy, that's really odd. What's the explanation? And according to Google, this is the official explanation. These are areas where two different sky surveys didn't quite overlap. And so they basically have a box where there's no data. But that seems to be somewhat skeptical, because if you look at this one to the right in infrared, you can see there clearly is some object right behind that box that's radiating very brightly. And if they didn't have a photograph of that object, you wouldn't get these light spikes that you see over here. So right there is some evidence that they do have what is behind that box, but they have then covered it up. Here's another update I just saw in 2019, and hopefully our viewers at home can see this. This was found by somebody in China. Here's another black box, and if you want to look for it yourself, here are the coordinates. So basically in astronomy, they use something that's just like latitude and longitude, but they call it right ascension. It's in hours and minutes, and then declination, which is in degrees. So don't be intimidated by these numbers, everybody. It works just like latitude and longitude. And if you all look right here where my cursor is, somebody from China basically wrote the word prove. And if you look very closely, you can see a little diffraction spike of light coming down from that black box. And that shows they do have an image of a star behind that, but then they covered over it with a box. So I'd encourage you, go onto Google Sky and find these boxes for yourself. Here's just one more. And this is kind of interesting. Again, you can see a bright object behind it radiating in infrared. This is around the constellation Virgo the Maiden, and her bright star Spica, which is not far from Leo the Lion. So we have a number of these boxes on sky surveys. And so one of the scary things to me, and I don't want to get too deep into stellar astronomy here, but we basically can calculate the distances to faraway objects by something called the Doppler method. And some astronomers have questioned now, even though this is a stable pillar of astronomy, whether the calculations we're deriving from the Doppler shift are entirely accurate. So simply what it might mean, Jennifer, is there's a chance that some of the objects we assume are very far away are actually a lot closer to us than we realize. All right, just so we don't scare anybody too much, let's try to show both sides of the story here as we wrap up. Understand, so far, there have been multiple doomsday scenarios, and none of them have come true. Probably the most recent one was the Mayan apocalypse of 2012. So we have to realize, so far, at least statistically, there's a 100% chance so far that a doomsday rumor will be incorrect. And a lot of times, what people will do online to make some clickbait is they'll actually take an image that is real and a fact that is actually true, but then they'll tweak the headline. So check this one out, everybody. This one usually comes out around every July or August. It makes its rounds on social media. And so you see this picture of a NASA press conference, and the headline will be, NASA claims 15 days of darkness across planet. And I've even had some well-respected colleagues forward this to me and say, oh my gosh, what's happening? Well, it turns out there will be 15 days of darkness, but it only happens at the polar regions of the Earth around the winter or summer solstice. So what a hoaxer's done is they've taken a real picture from a NASA press conference, and they've taken a real fact, but then they extrapolate it around the whole Earth. And so they make some really, really scary clickbait. So you have to be careful with this. You can also go on to any search engine you want and type in Planet X Nibiru photograph, and you find a whole bunch of things. And initially they can look quite scary. But so far, all the ones that have been posted are either sundogs or lens flares or reflection off something in the camera or just a straight up hoax. So here's just one example. This was posted as Planet X. Somebody in Nova Scotia, Canada, supposedly photographed the sun and then Planet X or Nibiru right beside it. Now let's just think about this. If it was really this obvious, people from all around the world would be photographing it. And yet somehow we just have this one man or woman in Canada that did it. So notice on this one, everybody, the Planet X is basically the same exact size as the sun. So what happens a lot, if you point your camera, whether it's a camera or a cell phone, directly at a bright light source, the image will actually reflect off of the internal components and it can make a duplicate image. So what I'd like to do very quickly, take a look at all these, everybody. These are 3 different examples of Planet X that are shown online. 2 of them are natural phenomena. 1 of them is a straight up Photoshop hoax. So take 20 seconds right now, try to pick the one that's the Photoshop hoax, and then we'll see if you're right. Jennifer, I want you to do it too, because I'm going to put you on the spot.
Okay. So I think I figured out the Photoshop hoax, which is the one with the boat in it.
Well, let's go step by step and let's see if you're right. The first picture is real, but it's not Planet X. So what we're seeing here, everybody, is a really cool phenomena. They're called sundogs. And it usually happens during the winter time. And if you look here in the field, you can see there's snow on the ground, there's leaves off the tree. And these are usually most prominent at sunset when the sun will refract off of ice crystals in the upper atmosphere. And it won't make a full rainbow, but it'll just make a little piece on the sky to the east and west of it. So very weird looking sometimes. Sometimes it can actually look like a whole cross, but this is just a sundog. Picture 2, not Planet X, but this is actually more than likely a lens flare, just like I showed you in the previous image. So the circle shape you see here is not the planet, but it's actually the shape of the aperture, basically like the eyelid, the shutter that opens and closes on the camera. So Jennifer, congratulations, you're exactly right. Number 3 is the Photoshop hoax. Can you tell us why, what tipped you off that this one was a hoax?
Well, if it was actually an object creating sun, like the object next to it, you might see the reflection on the water. And there's no reflection on the water.
You're exactly right. And you can see why this one would be tough for a hoaxer to really look good. It's very easy to just put something else in the sky, but then when you've got to replicate the reflection right through irregular water, that would be very difficult. So just so people at home don't get too freaked out, so far, every online has been a natural phenomenon or a direct hoax. So real quick, let's talk about what they're actually looking for now. Astronomers are looking for a solar system companion, a Planet 9, but they do not think it's Nibiru. And a lot of times in astronomy and science in general, even though they don't want to admit it, it still is a popularity contest. If you have the cool guy or cool girl astronomers suggest something, people go along with it. So these 2 astronomers you see here are very well known, and some say infamous. On the left, we have Caltech's Mike Brown. On the right, we have his Russian colleague, Konstantin Batygin. And these 2 are the so-called killers of Pluto's planethood. So they led the charge to get Pluto demoted down to a minor planet. And so to their credit, in 2016, what makes their hypothesis stronger is they gave at least a mathematical model about where a new planet should be. And if it's real, they think it would be very large, at least 10 times the mass of Earth. It would explain the odd orbits of some of the outer solar system objects, and it would serve as a perfect counterweight to balance the rest of the solar system. So Jennifer, here's the best analogy I can give. If you all check out this diagram, here we have our sun, and then this tiny blue circle would be the orbit of the former planet Pluto. So basically everything we know in our solar system is contained inside that little blue circle. Now, all the gray loops that you all see over here to the left, these are all confirmed minor planets, including the minor planet of Sedna. So these are all there. And so the curious thing, everybody, is notice all the orbits that you see are basically over to the left of the sun. So what Brown and Betagen figure is there has to be at least one object orbiting to the right of the sun to balance the other ones out. Because like anything else, gravity likes to be balanced too. So here's my overlay. Here's the analogy I always give. Think about it like kids on a playground on a seesaw. The sun is basically your fulcrum. And right now, we got a whole bunch of little kids over on the left side of the seesaw. But for some reason, the seesaw is perfectly balanced. So somewhere way over on the right in the shadows so far, there should be one big kid lurking. And that's where they're looking for Planet 9. So the only real difference here between those who follow Sitchin and Ancient Aliens versus mainstream astronomers is the distance. If you all notice, everybody, the orbit of this Planet 9, even at its closest, comes nowhere near the orbit of Pluto. Whereas those believe the Nibiru background think that it would actually get very, very close to our sun. So that's what mainstream astronomers are looking for, and that's why it's different than the legends of Nibiru. So kind of just to sum up here, Jennifer, before we end on a high note, statistically, we don't want to get too freaked out. It's still unlikely that a doomsday event occurs within our lifetimes. It's been predicted many times in recent history. It's never actually happened. Still, I also think we're making a mistake of totally ignoring what the ancients were saying. We do have evidence from a lot of different sources that there were global scale environmental changes that affected our ancestors. They could be very, very rapid and unexpected. And so far, the mainstream either hasn't looked at it closely or they've totally flip-flopped and they've ignored their old research. We also have to realize that the majority of stars in our galaxy do have companion stars. So it's not that big of a stretch to think that our sun could have a long-distance partner. And within our lifetimes, we could face a close star, an asteroid, or a comet impact. We're statistically overdue for a big one. NASA right now is testing technologies to try to impact and divert an asteroid or comet to see if they can do it. And finally, number 5, even if you're of a more skeptical slant and you haven't really bought into a lot of what I've presented, I think we all have to realize that talk about Nibiru is good, even if it's not there. It reminds us that even though our planet seems very, very large at the scale of us humans, it's basically just a teeny tiny little blue speck of dust in a nearly infinite cosmic ocean. And so singular events can happen here that can affect our whole planet. So just to try to end on a positive note, and I do have one more video clip here for you, and a little bit of a conspiracy, but this time a good one. What if there's a chance we haven't been hit yet because we already have a secret Earth defense system in place? And some people think we have exactly that. So Jennifer, you might remember this one. This was 2013. There was a huge fireball that exploded during the days in the sky right over Russia. And so it didn't actually hit the ground. If it had, thousands, if not millions of people could have perished instantly. Thank goodness it exploded in the air, but just the shock wave of air caused millions of dollars of damage. And so where the conspiracy comes in is after the fact, researchers looked frame by frame at this fireball, and they saw what appeared to be an anomalous object enter from the right of the screen. It then merges with the fireball, and a second later, the whole fireball basically disintegrates. And so let me show you a quick video clip that I pulled from YouTube. And this is really interesting. You're going to be able to see the actual fireball, and then you're actually going to hear the Russians actually admitting that they actually shot it down. So let me just stop the share for 1 sec.
Thank you, James. This is fascinating.
Jennifer. Okay. We are ready. Let me just try one more share screen.
A shower that prompted panic in Russia, causing around 1,000 injuries and devastating buildings, is being linked by some to today's flyby of asteroid DA14, the so-called city killer, set to go down as the closest ever recorded near-Earth object. NASA has assured us that the asteroid has no chance of hitting the Earth or any of its orbiting satellites. However, some scientists, like astronomy professor Tatiana Bordavinsa and Simon O'Toole, an astronomer at the Australian Astronomical Observatory, are claiming that the meteor shower over Russia could have been a stream of debris from the asteroid itself. And even skeptics of that claim, like Dr. Stephen Lowry, are calling the event an incredible coincidence.
So basically what they're saying is, wait a minute, you said this object was way too far away from the Earth for there to ever be an issue, but at the exact time it was making its closest approach, we had a very large meteor shower over Earth.
However, those claims are by no means the most lurid, being linked with the meteor shower. According to unconfirmed reports cited by Russia Today, the meteorite was intercepted by an air defense unit at the Urzhumka settlement near Shebelinsk. A missile salvo blew the meteorite to pieces at an altitude of 20 kilometers, local newspaper Zanak reported.
So basically, just to end on a positive note here, is there actually a chance that the reason we have not been hit by something is because we already have an Earth defense system in place, and that's been protecting us from some very large impacts that otherwise would have hit? So Jennifer, thank you very much. Viewers at home, thank you very much. That just about concludes my presentation on the legend of Planet 9, Planet X, Nibiru, and nearby brown dwarfs. Jennifer, I'm going to go ahead and turn screen control back over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, James. One of the things I didn't hear you touch on, but is part of these worldwide legends, and I think would tie in with what you're discussing, is records of the day the earth stood still, or the day the sun rose in the west instead of in the east. I don't know if you've ever heard of those, but I've heard of 24-hour periods of darkness, or days when the sun never set, you know, depending on where people were on different parts of the earth. And if there was a brown dwarf that looped through and affected our gravity, I could see that that would slow down the Earth's ability to spin, and, you know, may make it seem like 24 hours of darkness, 24 hours of daylight. I just wondered if you had any comments on that, or if you'd ever researched those myths as well.
That's fascinating. I've actually only heard the day the earth stood still as either a figure of speech or it relates to that one sci-fi classic Alien movie. Just thinking, I know right at the crucifixion story, they talk about that happening and the sky's going dark, and most people thought that was an allegory, but that's really fascinating. I'm probably going to go ahead and start researching that just to see if there are some more firsthand accounts from around the world of that. I think that would give a lot of credence to it. So I'll definitely look into that. Thank you.
I was also going to ask you if you ever connected with the Electric Universe guys. There's a whole group, they call themselves the Thunderbolts Project, and they have annual conferences, usually in Arizona or Albuquerque, New Mexico. And it's a group of physicists and astronomers who come together, and they discuss concepts of electrical theories that affect how the planets are actually caught in their orbits with one another. And they try to delve more deeply into understanding really what the anomalous gravity really is. And they believe that there are electrical currents or plasmas, that what we think of as dark matter is actually filled with electrical current. And it's that electrical current that creates magnetism that keeps the planets where they are, that they're kind of in balance with each other because of this magnetism. And once scientists more fully understand that, we'll literally be able to travel within that sphere of magnetism, because we'll be able to use that to power crafts. And like we can float a ship on the ocean, we can float crafts on this magnetism. And it's why they believe that the sunlight actually, when there's, say, a coronal mass ejection from the sun, it kind of spills off and loops slowly into this bubble, or what looks like maybe a quotation mark or something, as it's creating this mass that gets ejected from the sun. But then as it spreads out through this electrical field, it actually speeds up and hits the earth faster than it actually leaves the sun. And this is part of their theories that prove that, according to what they believe, their electric universe theories. They kind of all have read Velikovsky's work, Immanuel Velikovsky, who was this Russian, physicist. And they applaud him, and they think his theories were ridiculed and not really fully researched. And we will come to these greater conclusions as physics expands. I wondered if you knew of this group, the Thunderbolt Project and the Electric Universe Conference.
Isn't this the group that had the theory that Valles Marineris, the huge canyon on Mars, was actually formed not from the crust just cracking open, but from a weapon of extreme power during an ancient war long ago? Because I seem to remember this group actually passing a high voltage current between two different inductors, and they could basically get it to look exactly like the huge canyon shape on Mars. And they were using that to try to show that it was highly likely a long time ago there were advanced civilizations in our solar system, and they were using weapons like that, like what they talked about in the Indian Vedic texts. Is that the same group?
I've never heard them mention that at a conference. I've been to 2 or 3 Electric Universe conferences. Mostly they just study plasmas and natural earth processes that happen with weather and magnetism and things like this. So no, I don't know about, but that really sounds absolutely fascinating. Okay. But I
think it's really incredible.
Pardon?
Well, I was just going to say, I think it's really incredible because basically our understanding of gravity right now comes from Albert Einstein's general relativity. And it's basically gravity as a function of the curved geometry of the fabric of space-time. And so we assume it happens just because of mass, the masses of planets and moons and stars. But as you were sort of alluding to, it could definitely be incomplete. And I think as a civilization, we are woefully behind on our understanding of magnetism and electricity. I feel like a lot of great minds of the early 1900s, like Nikola Tesla, made great progress there, but it seems like a lot of their contributions have almost been intentionally minimalized. So to your point, I would find it fascinating, and it would not really surprise me if there's a lot more to gravity than we realize. I know physicists today are even trying to look for what they're just calling a gravity particle, because most of the fundamental forces you can break down into particles, but gravity and electromagnetism so far are simply fields. So yeah, I would find that line of research very fascinating.
Yes, so I'll send you a link to some of their material. I'm on one of their, I'm on a subscription, so they mail me things regularly when they're make discoveries, and they have a lot of video material out there. So there's two main founders to the electric universe theory. And one is Walt Thornhill. He's a brilliant physicist from Australia. And another man teamed up with him named David Talbot. And David Talbot is more of a cultural historian, much like you were mentioning the Chinese who made records of certain things. He studies ancient cultures' histories, and he has studied the Sumerian history, and he overlaps that in with some of the electric universe proposals and theories. So I think you'll find it fascinating. So I think what we'll do is we'll wrap up here. I am just so thrilled this went as well as it did for our first Zoom recording. And as always, I so enjoy listening to how your bright mind works, James, and the various things you pay attention to. Like I was certainly paying attention to Oumuamua and Avi Loeb from Harvard. That was really got my attention. And I've continued to study and follow what Avi Loeb has to say. He's the, for people listening, he is the Harvard astronomer who suggested that Oumuamua wasn't just some kind of asteroid, but was probably some sort of interstellar visitor because of the fact that it came in at one speed, then sort of slowed down, then turned, and then took off at much faster speed. Asteroids don't do that.
Right.
That
Incredible.
really is still lacking its accurate or due respect within the media. Few people continue to talk about that.
And isn't it fascinating when something like that, is discovered? You would think if science is what it's supposed to be, everybody would get together and go over theories and try to figure it out.
And
it's mostly just ignored.
Right. What I recently just heard, and I don't have the notes in front of me, but there was another interstellar visitor, and it showed up in 2019. And I don't think it was as close to the sun. I think it was further out, but it was detected and it did similar things, moved in erratic ways. So I have to kind of go find that and put it in my notes, but I want to say it was July 2019, and I never heard about it. Like didn't even make the news, right?
Wow.
It was probably in the back page of the New York
Interesting.
Times somewhere. So there may be more than one that has shown up. So, well, I think what we'll do is we'll end here, and if we're lucky, we may be able to do a Zoom Q&A, which I will work on trying to set that up. But thank you so much. I so appreciate this.
Okay.
And we'll look forward to talking soon.
Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it.
Okay.
Okay.
Bye.
Thanks, Jennifer. Bye.
You're welcome. Bye. Thank you.